Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael, on a Thursday. I want to talk about a subject that I'm not sure most people are aware of. And this concerns what I call the two sides to the same dissenting coin. And some information about this topic that I just haven't seen in popular circles. And I want to bring it to people's attention because it's something that I've uncovered in my own investigation of the Magisterium. And I'd like to put it out there for other people to contemplate. When I talk about the two sides to the same dissenting coin, a phrase that I've used often on the show, what I'm referring to is this. There's two groups in the Catholic Church right now, traditionalists and progressives. Now, they're not the only two groups. Don't misunderstand me. There's certainly vocal groups within the Catholic Church. So I'm not reducing groups in the Catholic Church to these two, but I'm highlighting these two. There are two very vocal groups in the Catholic Church: radical progressives and radical traditionalists. And I submit that they have the same exact problems. They don't necessarily contest some of the same teachings. They certainly have different beliefs, but they have the exact same characteristics and behaviors and the exact same dissent against the magisterium in many cases. That's why I say they are two sides to the same dissenting coin. Now, I'm speaking here broadly and generally. There's always exceptions to this on both sides with your radical traditionalists and radical progressives. There are exceptions. I'm just painting with broad strokes here. It's as if there's this coin of dissent. One side is radically progressive and wants to detach itself from conserving the church's teachings. The other side is the exact opposite, and it wants to conserve things that are not necessarily definitive in nature, to the point that they are willing to oppose any kind of development. And I'm talking authentic development, not changes in dogma. I'm not talking about that. That's not development. But any kind of legitimate development on the part of the teaching authority of the church, they will sometimes resist those things in the name of tradition. Again, two sides to the same dissenting coin. And here's what I want to bring to your attention. I want to ask a few questions here. I want to ask, where did the idea of dissent from the merely authentic magisterium come from? And you're probably going to be shocked when you find out. Maybe not so much the progressives, they probably won't be shocked, but the radical traditionalists probably will be, or at least confused. Because this is something that both groups are doing. Both groups, radical traditionalists, radical progressives, will look at some teachings of the magisterium and they will say, I will not submit. I will not assent to this. I will not accept it. And they'll both usually say the same thing. Well, it hasn't been taught infallibly. And so some radical progressives will argue, well, Humanae Vitae and the church's teachings against artificial contraception, they'll argue, haven't been taught definitively. Therefore, it's merely authentic. That is merely authoritative. It's non-definitive in nature. It's the merely authentic magisterium. And thus, since it's non-definitive, I can withhold assent and I can say, you know what, it's ultimately up to my conscience on whether or not the use of artificial contraception in a marriage is morally permissible. Likewise, though the radical traditionalists usually won't contest that doctrine, they will contest other doctrines that they will identify in the same category. They'll say there are some other teachings in the post-conciliar era, perhaps some of the teachings of Vatican II, perhaps some of the teachings of Pope Francis. And since they're not taught definitively with a charism of infallibility, They're taught with the merely authentic magisterium, that is, they're non-definitive in nature. I'm permitted to dispense with assent, and I can resist these teachings. It's the exact same position that many radical progressives maintain for their dissent against certain magisterial teachings. Now, again, somebody might hear say, well, but no, aren't they dissenting against definitive teachings? But hold on, wait. Some of the things that the radical traditionalists are claiming are non-definitive, it could be argued, are also definitive in nature. So wait, let's not rush to conclusions. Both sides are doing this. But if you don't like that example, there's plenty of others that, are non-definitive in nature that radical progressives would reject. Some things that some popes in the post-conciliar period have said non-definitively in their magisterium that the radical progressives don't like. They'll say, I don't have to assent to it. Likewise, some radical traditionalists will do that with some aspects of Vatican II or even Pope Francis and his authentic magisterium. So again, even if we have some disputed cases on what is definitive and what is not, at the end of the day, it could certainly be pointed out that there are plenty of teachings that both radical traditionalists and radical progressives withhold assent to and even dissent from, and they're in the category of non-definitive teachings. But where did this come from? Where did this come from that you can dissent from non-definitive teachings? That's the question. One question that I want to ask. When is the first time in church history that we see this being explicitly taught? Now, I'm not saying that it might not have been implied in church history in previous centuries or something like that. But what I want to say is, when is the first time we see this explicitly in church history? That is, that a Catholic is free to dissent from the merely authentic magisterium, that is non-definitive teachings. It's one question that I want to ask. It's going to be an interesting answer. And number two, once we find out that answer, I then want to ask the question, upon what basis can one side of this dissenting coin critique and criticize the other side for their dissent when they're doing the exact same thing, but just in different areas of doctrine? So, for example, how can the radical progressives get onto and criticize radical traditionalists for their dissent against some teachings of, say, Pope Francis or Vatican II, when the radical progressives are dissenting from some non-definitive teachings themselves, perhaps Humanae Vitae? Again, some might say, well, Humanae Vitae is definitive. I understand that. They're arguing it's non-definitive, so I'm just using their terms. By their own admission, they're in dissent from these teachings. So upon what basis can they criticize the radical traditionalists? Now, what the radical traditionalists will do is they'll come along and say they're the solution to the radical progressives in the Catholic Church. All these dissenters who want to cast off the traditions of the church, the radical traditionalists present themselves as the solution to those individuals. And yet, upon what basis can they really criticize the radical progressives for their dissent against some teachings, some of which are definitive and also some of which are non-definitive in nature? Just depends on what we're talking about. Upon what basis can they criticize the radical progressives when the radical traditionalists are doing the same? And even some radical progressives could point out that some of the teachings that some radical traditionalists are rejecting are in fact definitive in nature, not even just non-definitive. So it's again, wherever you land on these issues, definitive, non-definitive, for this or that teaching, it's the same scenarios with both sides at the end of the day. And thus, one group cannot criticize the other because they're two sides to the exact same dissenting coin, and they get it from the same place, whether they realize it or not. And I'm going to explain to you where they got it from. But since they can't criticize each other because they're both guilty of the exact same thing, I want to present to you at the end of this an alternative. It's not an either or. It's not radical traditionalism or radical progressivism. There is a Another option here, a third option. And I want to present that to you as a solution. Now, let's tackle the question. Where did the idea of dissent from the merely authentic magisterium, that is the non-definitive teachings, if you want, use non-technical terms here, non-infallible. Okay. Where did this concept come from? That a Catholic can push back against and refuse to accept non-infallible teachings of the magisterium that are authentically taught and promulgated. Where did that come from? Who's the first to say that explicitly? I'm not saying it wasn't implicitly. Who's the first to explicitly say that? In fact, since we're live, I'll give y'all a second to answer. Maybe somebody knows in the chat. If you don't know, I'm going to tell you, but I'm curious. Does anyone know? Maybe put it in the chat. I'll give you just a few seconds here. Put it to @ Reason of Theology. Tell me, the first time we explicitly see in church history that there are non-definitive teachings of the church that can be in error, and thus a Catholic is free to dissent from those erroneous teachings of the magisterium. When is the first time that comes up? Somebody says Protestantism. I'm saying within the realm of Catholicism, right? Obviously, you have plenty of groups who broke away from the Catholic Church, but I'm saying within the Catholic Church. Now, again, I understand some of these figures from the Reformation broke away from the Catholic Church. I totally get that, but they also went really far with it. Talking about those who have remained in communion with the Catholic Church, but they teach that non-definitive teachings of the church can be in error, and thus a Catholic can dissent from them. Somebody says the Copts. Nope. Good guess, though. Somebody says Lefebvre. Nope. Lefebvre wasn't the first. Nope. Lefebvre actually is not the first by any means, but you're going to be shocked when you find out where Lefebvre would actually have to get it from. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and tell you the German bishops. That's where they got it from. The first group in church history, to my knowledge, and to the knowledge of the scholars on the magisterium that I've read, the first group to explicitly say that non-definitive teachings of the church can be in error, not definitive teachings, because the Protestants were saying even those exercises of the magisterium that are considered infallible are in fact non-infallible. No, we're talking about non-definitive teachings of the church. The first group to explicitly say non-definitive, thus non-infallible teachings of the church can be in error, and thus a Catholic can dissent from them, is the German bishops in the year 1967. What happened 1 year later? You'll find out here in a moment, and you'll see why I even asked the question. But just think, what happened 1 year later? What did the German bishops do 1 year later? The first group to explicitly reject non-definitive teachings and to explicitly say that the magisterium can teach not heresy, but error in non-definitive teachings or merely authentic magisterium is the German bishops. And this is, in fact, something that many radical traditionalists today are relying on. Many radical traditionalists are saying, you know what? It wasn't taught infallibly by Pope Francis, thus I can reject it. You know what? That teaching by Vatican II wasn't infallible, thus I can reject it. You got that from the German bishops in 1967, the same German bishops who 1 year later did something very interesting that radical traditionalists would not agree with. Maybe somebody can guess. Somebody said, was it related to Humanae Vitae? Bingo. In 1968, the German bishops rejected Humanae Vitae and said that a person could exercise individual conscience in this area. Let me read something to you here. I'm going to share my screen. The crisis of the Catholic Church in Germany declared itself 45 years ago with the Königsteiner Erklärung, which I don't know German, but I do know that this is a document that they released in 1968, a declaration of the bishops regarding Humanae Vitae in 1968. This document rejected Humanae Vitae for the individual conscience. Therein, they toned down the church's teaching, leaving it up to the conscience of the individual to decide whether to use contraception or not. Again, What's interesting here is the first group to say these non-definitive teachings can be rejected and in fact exist is the German bishops of 1967. The same German bishops 1 year later rejected Humanae Vitae upon what basis? The exact same basis. They argued it's non-definitive in nature. They argued Humanae Vitae is non-definitive and thus we can reject it. Now, that's a whole debate in and of itself. Is it definitive? Is it not? As we're going to see here in a moment, you're going to see why some of them argued it's non-definitive. And since they say, thus, since it is non-definitive, we are free to reject it based on individual conscience. But isn't that the exact same problem with radical traditionalists today? Don't say, oh, the German bishops are denying something definitive. Table that for a moment. But they're claiming to reject something non-definitive upon individual conscience. Whether they're right or wrong on that is a different issue. But guess who is also arguing that very thing? Radical traditionalists. They're saying, these are non-definitive teachings of Vatican II, and thus I can reject them. These are non-definitive teachings of Pope Francis, and thus I can reject them. They're doing the exact same thing that the German bishops are doing, and they got it from the German bishops. So my question then is, upon what basis can the radical traditionalists critique and criticize the radical progressives for their dissent? And likewise, the radical progressives are hardly in a position to criticize radical traditionalists in their dissent from some papal teachings of Pope Francis when, for crying out loud, are you really in obedience to Humanae Vitae, for instance? You can't really criticize the radical traditionalists. Because I see it on both sides, both of them trying to criticize each other. And I just think, you guys are two sides to the exact same dissenting coin, and you got your same understanding of dissent from the exact same place. I want to read something to you here. This is this is an article from the New Dictionary of Theology. Editors are Kamonchak, Collins, and Lane. The article on the Magisterium is written by none other than Francis Sullivan. I'm doing my dissertation on. I don't agree with Sullivan on everything. In fact, this is one of the areas I don't agree with him on. Humanae Vitae, for instance. You'll see why here in a second. He takes the position, Sullivan takes the position that he accepts Humanae Vitae, but he believes it's non-definitive in nature. He doesn't believe it's infallible. He believes it's non-definitive in nature because he sees what's called the ordinary and universal magisterium in a very, very, very limited and rigid way that I'm not sure holds water after Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. But he was a brilliant individual, and he sees Humanae Vitae as non-definitive, but still binding, right? It's binding as a non-definitive teachings, but merely non-definitive, not infallible in nature. He has a section in his article here on the Magisterium where he talks about the limits of magisterial authority. I want to read that one to you. I also want to read to you his section on the ordinary papal magisterium, which is then going to take us into the German bishops of 1967 and their declaration. Actually, I should say more of a semi-letter that they were circulating. It wasn't a declaration that they were passing around to each other, where they first speak about dissent against non-definitive teachings because a non-definitive teaching of the magisterium could be an error. First time we see that explicitly in church history, to my knowledge. This is actually something that is found. It's very hard to find what the German bishops wrote in 1967, and thus you generally won't hear it being brought up. Most do not seem to be aware of it. Because, again, it was a semi-private document by the Secretariat of the Conference of German Bishops in the autumn of 1967. The only English translation of it is from Karl Rahner. In his Theological Investigations, Volume 17, he critiques the document of the German bishops. And in critiquing it, since he realizes it's very hard to find, he reproduces the document for us in English, or at least the relevant sections. And I will read the relevant sections to you, the whole thing. To my knowledge, has never been read on YouTube. So I'll read the whole thing. Okay, let's first, however, look and see what Sullivan says. Again, in his article on the Magisterium. Limits of magisterial authority and infallibility. The question here concerns the matter about which the bishops and pope can teach with authority and under certain conditions with infallibility. Both Vatican councils had described this object as matters of faith and morals. Vatican II also describes the role of bishops as preaching to the faithful, committed to them the faith they must believe and put into practice. Lumen 25. They cannot claim to speak authoritatively. Also, an older term for that is authentically. That's why you'll hear me talk about the merely authentic magisterium. Authentic here means authoritative. Much less infallibly, unless the matter about which they speak pertains to Christian belief or to the practice of Christian way of life. Now, there are two ways in which something can pertain to this object of the church's teaching authority, either directly, as formally contained in the gospel message, or indirectly, as something in itself not revealed, but necessary for defense or explanation of the gospel truth. This is important. Pay attention to this, because this is really going to relate to why the radical progressives reject Humanae Vitae. And it's the same basis that enables the radical traditionalists to be in dissent against Pope Francis and parts of Vatican II. And thus, I just find it ironic that you have radical traditionalists critiquing people who are progressives for the rejection of Humanae Vitae when they're doing the exact same thing themselves. But here, notice this distinction. It's the distinction between what we call primary objects and secondary objects of the magisterium. Primary objects are those things that are in the deposit of faith. God has revealed them in divine revelation. Secondary objects are those teachings that are not necessarily explicit, or either explicitly or even implicitly in Scripture or divine revelation. They're not explicitly or even implicitly in divine revelation. Those things that are explicitly or implicitly in divine revelation are primary objects. Secondary objects are not found in divine revelation explicitly or even implicitly, but they're related. They're necessarily related, logically or historically, to something that is revealed by God in divine revelation. Those are what's called secondary objects. This is an important distinction to understand their reasons for rejecting Humanae Vitae, as you'll see here in a second. Matters of Christian belief and practice which are formally revealed constitute what is called the deposit of faith. This is the primary object of the magisterium. Sometimes you'll hear me talk about primary objects of infallibility. That's what I'm referring to. Though they don't necessarily have to be infallible in nature as far as their definitions. Matters of Christian belief and practice which are formally revealed constitute what is called the deposit of faith. This is the primary object of the magisterium. It embraces everything that God has revealed to us for the sake of our salvation, Dei Verbum 11. Other things which are not in themselves formally revealed, so they're not primary objects, but still pertain to Christian faith and practice insofar as they are required for the defense and explanation of the gospel, constitute the secondary object of the magisterium. I don't really like the way he defines that. That's an inadequate definition, in my opinion, of secondary objects. I like the definition that Ratzinger and Bertone gave for secondary objects, which is what I just gave to you, and that is these are things that are logically or historically necessarily related to something revealed by God. I think that's a little bit more specific than what he says here. Only what is in the primary object can be defined as a dogma of faith. Matters in the secondary object can be defined as true, but not as to be believed with divine faith, that is, faith directed to God as revealer. Thus, we call them usually dogmatic facts. So dogmas of faith, dogmas proper, defined or undefined, refer to those primary objects, things that God has revealed. Dogmatic facts refer to those definitive teachings of things that are logically or necessarily related to something in divine revelation, but it's not directly revealed by God. An example of a secondary object would be that the First Council of Nicaea 325 is an ecumenical council and is a valid ecumenical council. or that Pope Pius XII was the Pope in 1955. I mean, I forget the years of his reign from the 40s to parts of the 50s, I think. But, let's say for sure 1945. I know for sure he was Pope in 45. So who was the Pope in 1945? For sure. You can say as a dogmatic fact, it's Pius XII. Well, how do I know that? Did God reveal it somewhere in sacred scripture and divine revelation? That no, of course he didn't. It's not a primary object, but it is a secondary object because it was Pius XII who defined the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in 1950. And so he had to be a valid Pope to define that infallible teaching. So something that is divinely revealed by God hinges on this historical question of whether or not he was authentically the Pope at the time. That's a secondary object. Primary object would be something like, is Jesus fully God and fully man? Yes, that's in divine revelation. Okay, so those are primary objects, secondary objects. This is important. You'll see why. It is important to note that the infallibility of the magisterium with regards to secondary objects is itself not a dogma of Catholic faith, but a doctrine commonly held by Catholic theologians and confirmed by the ordinary magisterium. I won't contest that, but what he's saying is this. The church can infallibly teach your primary objects, your dogmas, things that God has revealed. The church can infallibly teach those. But then the question is, can the church infallibly teach secondary objects? Things that are not formally revealed, but are historically and logically necessary to preserve in order to maintain something that is revealed by God, secondary objects? Well, it's never infallibly taught that secondary objects can be taught infallibly by the magisterium. It has been taught infallibly that their church can teach primary objects infallibly, but it's never explicitly been taught or solemnly been taught that the church infallibly teaches secondary objects. But it is an ordinary teaching. It is something that Sullivan would argue is authentic, it's authoritative, it has been taught by the magisterium, but never infallibly. It's non-definitive in nature. Now, you might push back on that. You might say, well, no, I think it's definitively taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. We can have that discussion. But for Sullivan, he thinks that these secondary objects, it's never been infallibly taught that the church can teach them infallibly. And he also wants to say it's never really been infallibly clarified what the extent of these secondary objects are. And you're going to see here in a moment how he uses that to try to argue that, well, and thus, Humanae Vitae is not necessarily definitive in nature. You'll see this in a second. Again, I'm not saying I agree with him, but you can at least see where he's coming from and why he draws this conclusion. A question that is much discussed today is whether the particular and concrete norms of the natural moral law fall within the object of infallible magisterium. Listen to that. Particular and concrete norms of the natural moral law fall within the object of the magisterium. It is generally agreed that some of the basic principles of such law are also divinely revealed. So some of the basic principles, thou shalt not murder, stuff like that, that's in sacred scripture and in divine revelation. But getting more specific, in vitro fertilization or something like that, or in vitro fertilization, or the immorality of contraception, those are more specific. Those are not just general norms. Those are specific applications of moral norms. And he's going to say those are not necessarily within the scope of the church's infallible teaching authority. Some are going to push back against that and say, no. The infallible acts of the magisterium extend as far as the deposit of faith itself extends, and also to things that are necessary to preserve those things in the deposit of faith. So there'll be a debate here. He says it is generally agreed that some of the basic principles of such law are also divinely revealed, and as pertaining to the primary object could be infallibly taught. It's also generally agreed that the magisterium can speak with authority. Notice he said authority and not infallibly, on particular and concrete applications of natural law principles. For example, Humanae Vitae. And he speaks about this elsewhere in Creative Fidelity. However, many reputable Catholic theologians question whether statements of this kind can ever be said to be irreversibly true. In other words, some of these specific teachings of secondary objects, like concrete norms, not just general principles of moral theology, but concrete norms. The prohibition against use of artificial contraception within marriage or in vitro fertilization. He doesn't mention those specifically here. Some are going to argue those are not within the teaching authority of the church, infallibly speaking. They're only within its authority to speak authoritatively, yet non-definitively, non-infallibly. They argue that it is difficult to exclude the possibility that future experience, hitherto unimaginable or unimagined, might put a concrete moral problem into the new frame of reference, which would call for a revision of a norm that, when formulated, could not have taken such new experience into account. And since the infallible exercise of magisterium issues an irreformable judgment, it seems inappropriate to speak of infallibility in this context. So he's saying some theologians are going to argue whether or not the church can infallibly teach if the use of artificial contraception is always immoral in a marriage. That's what that boils down to. He's saying some are going to contest to that. And there's nowhere where the church has infallibly said that it can speak in such matters infallibly. He concedes that the church can speak authoritatively, but not necessarily infallibly here. The German bishops capitalize on that distinction right there. They capitalize on that point, and they will say, thus, in such cases, the individual conscience can withhold assent from these non-definitive teachings of the church against the use of artificial contraception. Again, part of the problem here is radical traditionalists are doing that exact same thing, but then they criticize the progressives for their rejection of Humanae Vitae. Again, painting with a broad brush here. On his section on the ordinary papal magisterium, Sullivan says, by ordinary papal magisterium, one means the teaching authority which the Pope exercises in a non-definitive way, either by the publication of their encyclical letters, apostolic constitutions, or by their explicit approval of doctrinal statements made by the Congregation for the Faith. So these are the non-definitive teachings of the Pope. Another way of speaking of them is the merely authentic magisterium. I like that term better than ordinary magisterium. Because ordinary magisterium could also refer to the ordinary and universal magisterium, which is definitive or could be definitive in nature. And it just muddies the waters and confuses people. And so I don't like that term. When the Pope solemnly defines a dogma, he is said to speak ex cathedra. Vatican II declares that religious submission of intellect and mind must be given to of will and mind, must be given to the teaching authority of the Pope, even when he is speaking, not speaking ex cathedra. That's Lumen Gentium 25. It says even when the Pope is speaking not ex cathedra, which tells you what? Non-definitively. Even in such cases, you're to give assent of intellect and will. You're to assent to these teachings in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence. The judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to according to his manifest mind and will. Lumen Gentium 25. The fact that religious submission of mind and sincere adherence are called for means that the response required is not mere obedience of the will, as it would be in the case of papal legislation, but rather obedience of the judgment. What is he saying? Well, he's saying this. Whenever a pope teaches non-infallibly, but he's actually teaching as pope, not as a private individual, but teaching as pope, even though it's non-affinitive, you are to assent to it. And not merely an assent of obedience, but he's saying an assent of the intellect as well, that you intellectually assent to the teaching. You adhere to, you accept the teaching as true. In other words, if I have already formed my opinion on a question, so I've already come to an opinion on a matter of theology, and the contrary view is authoritatively taught by the Pope, so the Pope teaches something different than what you've concluded, I'm obliged to renounce any attitude of obstinacy in my opinion and to adopt an attitude of docility towards papal teaching. So what he's saying is, based on the Second Vatican Council, and really it's not just Vatican II, it was also Pius XII who notes it in Humanae Generis. These non-affinitive teachings of the Pope, if the Pope teaches them, even if you don't agree with them, you are to assent to them. You're to accept them. You're to accept them as true. You're to be open towards the papal teaching. But he does give this caveat. Docility calls for an open attitude towards the official teaching, giving it a fair hearing, doing one's best to appreciate the reasons in its favor, so as to convince oneself of its truth and thus facilitate one's intellectual assent to it. So you hear the Pope teaching something that you don't agree with, you don't automatically say, I don't agree with that. Now, how many radical traditionalists does that describe? Almost everyone. Almost every single one of them. How many radical progressives does that also describe, depending on what Pope we're talking about? Almost every one of them, right? Two sides to the same dissenting coin. Does your average radical progressive, does your average radical traditionalist really wrestle with what the church teaches, really wrestle with what the Pope is saying or a council is saying? Do they really dig in and try to understand, well, why does the church teach this? And let me do everything that I can to prepare myself to accept this. And let me try to overcome the objections that I have. Is that really what your average radical traditionalist or progressive is doing? No. No. Don't be naive. They're not doing that, most of them. Some may, but most aren't. They're just flippantly and radically saying, I don't accept it. I don't accept what the Pope teaches here. And they're not doing everything that they can to properly form their conscience, to properly conform their intellect to the teaching and try to overcome their objections. To give the required religious submission to ordinary papal teachings means to make an honest and sustained effort to overcome any contrary opinion we may have, and to achieve a sincere assent of our mind to this teaching. This is something that Donum Veritatis talks about for the theologian, the role of the theologian, and their requirement to adhere to the non-definitive teachings of the church in both their mind and will. But it does note some rare exceptions where a well-trained theologian, after really doing everything they can to understand what the church is teaching and why it teaches it and to overcome certain things, in some rare cases could withhold assent to a non-definitive teaching. Well, that's not what most radical progressives and radical traditionalists are doing. They haven't really wrestled through the text, and that's most are just saying, I don't want to accept it because it's contrary to what I believe. They're still Protestants at the end of the day. Whether they're converts or not, they're still Protestants, because at the end of the day, they still want to say, it's ultimately up to me how I'm going to submit to the magisterium. I will submit to the magisterium only if I agree with it at the end of the day. Well, you're still operating with a Protestant way of understanding teaching authority when that's your perspective, which, again, I'm very concerned. That describes the majority of Catholics that I see commenting on social media. They don't really have a Catholic ecclesiology. They're still Protestants in one way or another. They still say, I will only agree with the magisterium if it agrees with me first. To give the required religious submission to such ordinary papal teachings means to make an honest and sustained effort to overcome any contrary opinion we may have and to achieve a sincere assent of our mind to this teaching. It is possible that people who have made such an effort still find that doubts about its truth remain so strong in their mind that they cannot actually give their sincere intellectual assent to it. So, since such people have done all they were capable of doing towards achieving assent, one cannot judge such non assent or internal dissent to involve any lack of obedience to the magisterium. Why am I reading this to you? Let me tell you why. He's saying there's some cases where a person has really wrestled with what the magisterium is teaching non-definitively. They've really tried every way they can to overcome their objections, but they just can't. And so that at the end of the day, they've really given an honest attempt here to offer religious submission of intellect and will to this teaching, but have failed to do so at the end of the day because their objections have not been overcome. And in such cases, they're actually they're not failing to give assent because they've made a good, honest effort to give that assent, is what he's arguing. Well, I'm not disputing that in principle, but I will point out that that's exactly what the radical progressives are going to rely on when they dissent from Humanae Vitae. When they say, well, it's non-definitive in nature, and I've done everything I can to accept Humanae Vitae. I've done everything I can to overcome these arguments and objections, but I still, at the end of the day, in my conscience, think that Humanae Vitae is wrong for this or this and this and that reason. Can you say that they're in dissent from the magisterium? Well, Sullivan is going to say such a person is not in dissent from the magisterium. Now, if you're going to say, well, I still think you are in dissent from the magisterium. Okay, well, just make sure you're not one of those radical traditionalists who's saying that while yourself being in dissent from the magisterium elsewhere. That's my point. Because the people who want to get onto the radical progressives for their lack of submission to the teachings of Humanae Vitae are generally going to be the very ones that are rejecting some post-conciliar teachings of perhaps Vatican II or something in Pope Francis's pontificate. So I'm just saying be consistent. Upon what grounds do you really criticize the radical progressives for rejecting Humanae Vitae when their reasons for doing it are the exact same reasons you have for rejecting certain post-conciliar teachings? They're exact same thing. Exact same thing. That's why I say two sides to the same dissenting coin. They have the exact same problems. It is also possible, Sullivan says, that such dissent may be not only subjectively blameless, but objectively justified. And now pay attention to this. Since, as the German bishops stated in their pastoral letter of 22 of September 1967, the ordinary non-definitive teaching of the church can, and on occasion, actually does fall into errors. Here's what's interesting. Here's my whole point. Again, the arguments that the progressives are going to use for dissenting against Humanae Vitae ultimately go back to what the German bishops are saying here in 1967 by the fact that non-definitive teachings of the church could contain errors. Now, it's true that non-definitive teachings of the church could contain errors to one degree or another, sure. By very definition, if they're non-definitive, they could be in there by definition of the word non-definitive. Otherwise, every teaching of the church would be infallible. But the church itself makes the distinction between infallible and non-infallible, definitive and non-definitive teachings. Thus, the church itself does recognize that some non-definitive teachings could, in fact, contain, to one degree or another, error. And you can also see that confirmed in Donum Veritatis, and also Bertone and Ratzinger's commentary on the Profession of Faith. So what the German bishops are saying about the church teaching could potentially teach error in its non-definitive teachings. We have to concede, okay, the magisterium itself does confirm that. Even though it was the German bishops who said it first, the magisterium has subsequently agreed that, yeah, that's actually true. So you can't push back on the German bishops here on this point particularly, because the magisterium itself concedes what the German bishops are saying. But the German bishops are the first ones to say it. And it's those same German bishops 1 year later who rejected Humanae Vitae for this exact same reason. So the point is, when the radical traditionalist says, I'm rejecting what Pope Francis teaches in this encyclical, I reject what Vatican II says in Lumen Gentium, I don't like what it says about invincible ignorance. I don't like what it says about Muslims. I don't like what it says here or there. Or I don't like Dignitatis Humanae in Vatican II and what it says on religious liberty. Oh, but hold on, wait. It's exactly what the German bishops are doing in the rejection of Humanae Vitae. And you actually, believe it or not, you kind of got it from them. They're the first ones to say it. Yes, subsequently, the magisterium confirmed it as true, but it was on that exact same grounds that 1 year later, the German bishops rejected Humanae Vitae. So I'm going to present a third alternative here so that you don't fall into either one of these errors, the radical progressives or the radical traditionalists. But let me finish this before we actually read the German bishops. The bishops went on to say, in order to maintain the true and ultimate substance of faith, the church must, even at the risk of error in points of detail, give expression to doctrinal directives which have a certain degree of binding force. And yet, since they are not de fide definitions of the faith definitions, involve a certain element of the provisional, even to the point of being capable of including error. So some of the teachings of the church may be just provisional or non-definitive in nature. They could just be provisional in nature, but they could contain error. Otherwise, it would be quite impossible for her to preach or interpret her faith as a decisive force in real life, or to apply it to each new situation in human life as it arises. And then he quotes Ronner, Theological Investigations, Volume 17, which is this very volume, which we're about to read on what the German bishop said. While in its treatment of the ordinary papal magisterium, Vatican II spoke only of its obligatory force and said nothing about the possibility of its needing to be corrected on several important issues. The council clearly departed from previous papal teaching. I don't agree. I don't agree with Sullivan here. I don't agree with him. This is what I'm writing my dissertation on, and this is where I part ways with him. There are very real differences between the decree on ecumenism and such an encyclical as Mortalium Animos of Pope Pius IX. I vehemently oppose that. There are different disciplinary differences there, of course. But as I just showed in a lecture last week, where I compare the decree on ecumenism and Mortalium Animos, and then I consider the long history of communicatio sacris, that is, the sharing of sacraments between Catholics and Orthodox after the schism, I point out that the difference in discipline here, and it is a disciplinary difference, is not very different than the difference in disciplines throughout history that we've had over and over and over, because some popes allowed for sharing in sacraments with schismatics, and some said, no, this is not a discipline we're going to allow at the moment. So I don't agree with Sullivan, because we're talking in the context of teachings, and he brings up a disciplinary difference. That's where I think Sullivan's off base. He's bringing up something I would hear from Jay Dyer or something like that. I mean, this is one of the arguments that somebody like Jay Dyer, an Eastern Orthodox apologist, would use, bringing up different disciplinary differences and try to interpret them as doctrinal contradictions with the magisterium. They're not doctrinal in nature. Again, as I demonstrated in the lecture I just did last week, maybe I'll put that in the show notes. But I think the name of the video was can Orthodox receive the sacraments? Can Catholics give the sacraments to Orthodox? I think is the name of it. I'll put it in the show notes. So I already have to depart company with Sullivan on this point. And he says, and between the Declaration on Religious Freedom and the teachings of Pope Leo XIII, I'm not so sure if I would concede doctrinal differences with what he is saying exists in Dignitatis Humanae with Pope Leo XIII. I did do a show with Catholic Answers where I talk about this, and made an attempt to reconcile some of these things. So I'm not willing to concede that as a doctrinal difference either. It seems to me like what Sullivan and many others do is they're very quick to jump to, yeah, the magisterium contradicted itself. And I want to say, I'm not so quick to jump to that and to concede that it has. It is difficult to see how the Second Vatican Council could have arrived at a number of its innovative decisions. See, notice this, talking about Vatican II as innovative in its doctrinal teachings. Okay, here's where I'm talking about two sides of the same dissenting coin. The radical progressives want to say that about Vatican II. You start pointing out the really traditional things that Vatican II said, point out to a radical progressive, point out to them where Vatican II talks about no salvation outside the church in paragraph 14 of Lumen Gentium. Point that out to them and watch them completely reject it. Watch them completely reject that teaching. Okay, but then point out paragraph 15 and 16 right after that of Lumen Gentium to a radical traditionalist and watch them reject that. They'll reject those paragraphs. They're two sides to the same exact dissenting coin. They just dissent from different teachings. But both of them dissent from some teachings of Vatican II. Your radical traditionalists will reject paragraphs 15 and 16 of Lumen Gentium, whereas your radical progressives will reject paragraph 14 of Lumen Gentium. Whereas in reality, paragraph 14, 15, and 16 can be harmonized. They're not in contradiction with each other. But again, they're both quick to throw Vatican II under the bus and say that it has innovations and errors in it. If it had not been for the preparatory work done by the theologians who, prior to the council, had been taking a critical stance towards elements of papal teachings which they judged were in need of correction. Does that sound familiar? It should. What Sullivan is saying here is one of the reasons why he claims that Vatican II teaches differently from some preconciliar popes. Again, I'm not granting that. But he's saying one of the reasons why it teaches so differently is because you've had all these theologians who have been so willing to reject the magisterium and its teachings. So that kind of prepared the ground for the council itself to recognize that it itself can teach differently than previous magisterial teachings. Again, I'm not granting any of this. But does that sound familiar? It should. Because there's a lot of radical traditionalists today who dissent from the magisterium, and they'll do so on grounds that someday this is going to help prepare the future magisterium to correct itself. The irony here, because it's the exact same thing that the radical progressives will argue. It's just two sides to the same dissenting coin. On this basis, one cannot exclude the legitimacy of the expression of responsible dissent on the part of those who are particularly competent to judge the issue and contribute to the process by which the church would arrive at a better grasp of the truth. Wow. Yeah. At least he says by those who are particularly competent. At least he adds that qualifier. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who are dissenting from the magisterium on social media who certainly it's not their area, so I'm not so sure that they're in a position to do so. They're certainly not the individuals that Dona Veritatis describes. Okay, well, let's take a look at the German bishops and what they said. Again, I've almost never heard anybody talk about this, aside from just a few theologians. It seems like many people aren't even aware of this. And again, that could be because this was a semi-private document being circulated. But my thing is, I've been fascinated with the concept of non-definitive teachings ever since I read the dissertation of Dr. King, Dr. Lawrence King from CUA. His dissertation, I know I talk about it all the time. Ever since I read that, I've just been fascinated with this concept of non-definitive teachings of the church because it has so many applications in apologetics. And I really dug my heels in on that and really said, okay, I want to really study this historically, this concept. Like, is this a recent um concept? Is this something that we just came up with recently, or is it there in the patristic era, maybe, or somewhere in the first millennium? I would say it's implied in the first millennium. I would certainly say it's implied. Um, let's say it's implied in, also in the second millennium, in the Middle Ages. Um, but I would say the first time it's explicit, to my knowledge, the first time it's explicit that you have non-definitive teaching specifically that can be in error in nature. To my knowledge, the first time that has ever come up was 1967 by the German bishops, the same German bishops who rejected Humanae Vitae. It so happens that they were right about their concept of non-definitive teachings, as far as them having the ability to err. The church confirmed that. But to my knowledge, they're the first ones to bring it up. So I've always been fascinated by that. So I've tried to really look into this and see what other people say about it, but there's just not a lot, unfortunately. And so I said, okay, well, this is the area I really want to write my dissertation on, because it seems like this is an area that really needs some more exposure. Well, again, this text was published by the Secretariat of the Conference of German Bishops in the autumn of 1967 as a semi-private document and disseminated at diocesan level. And I would argue it is partly the basis by which the German bishops rejected Humanae Vitae, but I don't argue that it fully gets them there. I don't. Here's why. Even if you concede, as the church itself does, that non-definitive teachings of the magisterium could contain error. Now, we haven't discussed what level of error. Are we talking heresy, or are we talking some lower level? That's a different discussion, and I have done multiple videos on it. But right now, we're just speaking of error in general. Well, the magisterium has already conceded that it could. But does that get you to rejecting Humanae Vitae? No, it doesn't get you to that point, because you still have to demonstrate that Humanae Vitae is an error, and you haven't done that. First of all, you have to demonstrate that Humanae Vitae is non-definitive. They may argue that, well, no, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate it's definitive in nature. So that's part of the debate. And then once you have maybe done that work, okay, well, one still has to demonstrate that Humanae Vitae is in fact an error. And so what the German bishops are saying here in 1967 doesn't get you to rejecting Humanae Vitae. I'm not arguing that it automatically gets you to rejecting Humanae Vitae, because I'll say, well, you could accept what they're saying here in 1967 in theory and still say that you can't reject Humanae Vitae. I'll grant that. But I'll just point out it's those same bishops who are in part using this as a way to justify the rejection of Humanae Vitae. In part. The other part is they want to say that the scope of the church's infallibility doesn't extend to particular applications of the moral law. And that's the other part. Okay. Again, this is Ronner, who provides an English translation, because you're not going to find this anywhere else. In order to avoid imposing upon the reader the wearisome task of having to search out the text referred to for himself, let us repeat the relevant section of the document here. It's a little lengthy, 2.5 pages. In fact, let me get some water. I'll return. Give me a 2-minute break, and I'll be back. I'm going to get some water, and then I'll go over it. All right, so I haven't chased this theory down, but I do want to put it out there. I don't know for a fact, but I kind of wonder if the German bishops released this in 1967 in anticipation of Humanae Vitae. Maybe they knew where the Pope was going to come down on this issue, or maybe they were just preparing for it, and so they were already preparing the grounds to dissent from Humanae Vitae by releasing this document. That's speculation on my part. I have not verified that. I'd have to look more into it, but I do want to throw that out as a possibility because I find it awfully interesting that 1967 they put this out, in 1968 they reject Humanae Vitae when Humanae Vitae comes out. It just doesn't. It's hard to believe that's coincidence. All right. So I don't think that he gives the whole translation. He gives paragraphs 17, he labels them 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and yeah, that's it. So I think he only gives part of the document, but he reproduces the relevant section here. Yeah, he says, let us repeat the relevant section of the document here. All right. So first time in history of YouTube, to my knowledge, this document has been read. At this point, with a difficult problem, or at this point, a difficult problem arises, calling for a realistic discussion. It is one which today more than formerly threatens either the faith of many Catholics or their attitude of free and unreserved trust towards the teaching authority of the Church. We refer to the fact that in the exercise of its official function, this teaching authority of the Church can, and on occasion actually does, fall in errors. There it is. It's explicit. Again, that's, to my knowledge, first time that is ever explicit as far as teaching authority. The fact that such a thing is possible is something of which the Church has always been aware and which she actually expressed in her theology. So they're arguing this isn't new to them. And I would agree it's not new. I think it was certainly implied prior to them, but I would be curious, are there any explicit references prior to them? Moreover, she has evolved rules of conduct to cater for the kind of situations which arise from this. This possibility of error refers not to those statements of doctrine which are proclaimed as propositions to be embraced with the absolute assent of faith. So they're not talking about infallible teachings. Whether by a solemn definition on part of the Pope, a general council, or by the exercise of the ordinary magisterium. Historically speaking, it is also incorrect to maintain that any error has subsequently arisen in such dogmas as proclaimed by the Church. This is, of course, not to dispute the fact that even in the case of such a dogma, while we must uphold its original meaning, it is always possible and always necessary for a development in our understanding of it to take place involving a progressive elimination of any misinterpretations which may perhaps have been attached to it hitherto, which the Magisterium confirmed that about a decade later, to my recollection. So about 10 years later, the Magisterium agrees with this. What did they just say? Well, what they said is that dogmas can't be in error. Those are infallible. But they're saying, but the way in which the dogma is expressed can sometimes be adjusted. Now, that's true to an extent, but Vatican I does have a canon that notes that dogmas always have the same meaning. You can't change the meaning. Otherwise, that is the classic definition of the modernist heresy. The modernist heresy, despite the way it's used by ignorant people today, modernism, classically defined as a heresy, is going to be you say that you affirm the dogma of the Church, but you completely redefine what the dogma means. So they're not saying that, but what they are saying is that, like, maybe some misunderstandings of what the dogma meant could be clarified. And that's true. And the Magisterium confirmed that. And an example of that would be I think that there have been some misunderstandings of the dogma of outside the church there is no salvation. Some people have misunderstood that, and the church has clarified what it means by that. Not changing the meaning, but changing some misunderstandings of the meaning. Nor should we confuse the question which we have raised here with the manifest fact that side by side with the immutable divine law, there is also a human law in the church which is subject to change. Changes in this latter have from the outset nothing to do with error. At most, they raise the question of how far some juridical decision in the remote or recent past was opportune. Now, I would just counter that by noting Donum Veritatis, released many years after this document, after 1967. Donum Veritatis does note that though the church in matters of prudence could occasionally be in error, it could not habitually be in error in matters of prudence. So I would just throw that out. It says, now let us consider the possibility or the fact of error in non-defined statements of doctrine on the part of the church, recognizing that these themselves in turn may differ very widely among themselves in the degree of binding force. The first point to be recognized resolutely and realistically is that human life, even as a wholly general level, must always be lived by doing one's best to one's lights. So you always want to do your best to try to understand the church according to your ability, to what you know. And by recognized principles, which, while at the theoretical level, they cannot be recognized as absolutely certain, nevertheless command our respect in the here and now as valid norms of thinking and acting, because in the existing circumstances, they are the best that can be found. So non-definitive teachings of the church, you have you have a obligation to do your best to assent to them. Somebody says in the chat, some make obfuscation of teachings a career, Michael, to be honest. Yeah. Sure. That's not in dispute. This is something that everyone recognizes from the concrete experience of his own life. Every doctor in his diagnoses, every statement in the political judgments he arrives at on particular situations and the decisions he bases on these is aware of this fact. The church, too, in her doctrine and practice, cannot always and in every case allow herself to be caught in the dilemma of either arriving at a doctrinal decision which is ultimately binding, that is infallible, or simply being silent and leaving everything to the freedom of opinion of the individual. So what it's saying is the church can't just issue, infallible teachings every single day of the year, it has to make some provisional judgments. And so because some of them are provisional in nature, they may not be free from all error. In order to maintain the true and ultimate substance of faith, she must, even at the risk of error in points of detail, give expression to doctrinal directives which have a certain degree of binding force, and yet, since they are not de fide definitions, involve a certain element of the provisional, even to the point of being capable of including error. But again, the irony here is the German bishops, 1 year later, rejecting Humanae Vitae, partly in basis of what it's saying here, when radical traditionalists are saying the exact same thing about rejecting some aspects of Vatican II for this exact same reason. They're using the "it's not infallible" card. It's not infallible. It wasn't taught infallibly. Okay. But that's exactly what some of the progressives are doing too, in their rejection of some magisterial teachings. Otherwise, it would be quite impossible for her to preach or interpret her faith as a decisive force in real life, or to apply it to each new situation in human life as it arises. In such a case, the position of the individual Christian in regard to the church is analogous to that of a man who knows that he is bound to accept the decision of a specialist, even while recognizing that it is not infallible. So when you go to the doctor, you know your doctor's not infallible, but you generally accept your doctor. Now, you might go and get a second opinion, but at that point, you're probably like, okay, well, if both of these doctors are saying it, you're probably accepting it, even though you know they're not infallible. They're saying the same thing about the non-definitive teachings of the church. At any rate, any opinion which runs contrary to a current statement of doctrine on the part of the church has no place in preaching or catechesis. This is what I thought interesting. Because the document's saying, okay, well, even though the magisterium could be in error in some non-definitive teachings, you shouldn't be preaching or teaching contrary to what the magisterium has taught. Which I just find that interesting in light of 1 year later with the rejection of Humanae Vitae. I mean, just how does that work, right? Even though the faithful may, under certain circumstances, have to be instructed as to the nature of and the limited weight to be attached to a current doctrinal decision of this kind. This is a point which has already been discussed. Anyone who believes that he is justified in holding as a matter of his own private opinion that he has already even now arrived at some better insight which the church will come to in the future must ask himself in all soberness self-criticism before God and his conscience whether he has the necessary breadth and depth of specialized theological knowledge to permit himself in his private theory and practice to depart from the current teachings of the official church. That's a slam dunk. Whatever you want to say about the German bishops at this time, they're dead on that point. What are they saying here? Rad trads, pay attention. Some rad trads and radical progressives will dissent from the magisterium of non-definitive teachings, and they'll say, well, at some point, the magisterium is going to back me up and vindicate me, and they're going to end up agreeing with me, and some future Pope Pius the 13th is going to come along and say I was right, and they're going to agree with me and rejecting this or that teaching. And you've heard this many times before, undoubtedly. From rad trads or radical progressives, they'll dissent from the magisterium and say, one day I'll be vindicated by the magisterium itself. And the German bishops are rightly pointing out, well, if you want to go that route, you have to really soberly ask yourself, do you really have the breadth and depth of specialized theological knowledge to permit yourself in your own private judgment and practice to depart from the current teachings of the official church? Are you really that wise? Are you really that knowledgeable about theology? I mean, maybe you are. Maybe you are. But likely you aren't. And so there should be some more humility there. And this is something I think we should take to heart because I see it nonstop. People flippantly disagreeing with the magisterium, and they'll say, oh, one day I'll be vindicated by the magisterium. Are you really sure you're in a position to make that judgment that the magisterium's in error? Have you really studied this issue in depth, thoroughly, more than the authentic teachers of the magisterium themselves? Have you really? When in 99% of the cases of people I see, they don't even know the basics of theology or ecclesiology, let alone are they in a position to make that judgment. And so clearly, there's a lack of introspection. There's a lack of self-awareness on one's own limits. You know, it reminds me of the Protestants, some Protestants out there who just, you know, I reviewed one of them the other day, who will just open up to a couple verses of the Bible and see, call no man father. Boom, Catholics, y'all don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't call priests father. It's right there in scripture. And it's like, you really don't recognize your limitations. You really don't realize how ignorant you actually are when you use that argument. Because Paul himself referred to himself as a father, and that is a spiritual father, because he wasn't a biological father, which is the exact same thing we're doing with Catholic priests. You haven't really thought that one through. And so often you'll see with some of these Protestants just very ignorant arguments where somebody brashly tries to say the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon and here's why, and they'll come up with the most ridiculous arguments that at the end of the day just show how ignorant the person is. And what you're seeing is ignorance on fire. You're seeing a person who, they don't realize how limited they are in their knowledge. it's even laughable how bad it can get, as we see in some cases where, you'll hear some KJV onlyists say that, that was somehow, if it's good enough for Paul, if the KJV was good enough for Paul, then it's good enough for me. And it's laughable how ignorant some of this stuff is. But I would likewise say the same is a phenomenon we encounter in the Catholic Church with some radical progressives, but especially some radical traditionalists. Ignorance on fire and a brashness and a haughtiness and an arrogance to say, I know better than the magisterium on this issue. Pope Francis is just clearly wrong, blah, 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 blah. When in reality, they haven't done the requisite study to be in a position to make that judgment. So I appreciate what the bishops are saying, at least here. Such a case is conceivable in principle. That is, there could be somebody who's a really educated theologian who recognizes an error in a magisterial document. That's possible. But is that the majority of people out there who are rejecting the magisterium on social media? Are they really experts in theology who are really able to? No. Such a case is conceivable in principle, but subjective presumptuousness and an unwarranted attitude of knowing better will be called to account before the judgment seat of Christ. When the German bishops have to put you in your place, it's bad. The same bishops who would reject Humanae Vitae are having to put you in your place for rejecting the magisterium. That's how it's bad. I mean, when they're saying, okay, maybe you do know better than the magisterium, but you probably don't, and you're going to have to give an account to Christ one day for your rejection of this teaching. So keep that in mind. Again, when the German bishops have to correct you for your theological dissent, it's gotten bad. It belongs intrinsically to the right attitude of faith in any Catholic seriously to strive to attach a positive value to even a provisional statement of doctrine on part of the church and to make it his own. And by the way, I will remind you, again, this is a semi-private document circulating among the German bishops. It doesn't mean that all German bishops agreed with this. Obviously, there were some that were more progressive than this. In secular life, too far-reaching decisions have to be taken on the basis of fallible findings on part of others, which have been arrived at according to their best lights. It is no less true in church matters that the individual need not feel any shame or diminishment of his own personality if in his findings he relies on the church's teaching, even in cases in which it cannot be accustomed as definitive from the outset. In other words, don't be ashamed to rely on the magisterium and to admit your ignorance. It is possible that in specific cases, the development of the church's doctrine proceeds too slowly, I'll say. But even in arriving at a judgment of this kind, we must be prudent and humble. Again, when the German bishops have to call people to prudence and humility, it's just... For in any such development of doctrine within a church made up of men subject to historical conditions, time is needed. For it cannot proceed any faster than the task permits of preserving the substance of the faith without loss. We do not need to fear that in adopting the positions of the church in the manner described, we are failing to respond to the claims of our own age. Often enough, the serious questions raised for us by our own age, in which we are called upon to answer on the basis of our faith, make it necessary for us to think out the truths of our faith afresh. It is perfectly possible that in the process, fresh points will come to be emphasized, but this is not the call to faith itself in question. Rather, it contributes to a deeper grasp of the truths of divine revelation and of the church's teachings. For we are firmly convinced, and we see that experience confirms us in this, that we need neither deny any truth for the Catholic faith, nor deny the Catholic faith for the sake of any truth, provided only that we understand this faith in the spirit of the church and seek always to achieve a deeper grasp of it. At a larger stage, we shall have a few brief remarks to make on the theological importance of this document in general and of the passage quoted in particular. The only observation to be made at this point is that of an Italian version of the document appeared in the Observatory Romano. So this is the part of this, I think, is a part from Ronner of the 15th December 1967 document. Incidentally, I know that the document was read in the refectory in the presence of the learned professors of the Gregorianum, and was received most favorably there. It can hardly be as bad, therefore, as it is judged to be in the text, which we are about to quote. The text is particularly remarkable to the extent that, so far as I know, this is the first occasion on which this problem has been explicitly tackled at all in a relatively official document. Previously, it had been left solely to the theologians to discuss. And yeah, you might see some theologians discussing it, but even then I would like to see where they're explicitly admitting error. It seems like maybe Franzlin and others would talk about the theological safety of these non-definitive teachings, and thus they're kind of admitting an error. But this is a little bit more official than that, since it's part of the German bishop, so it's a little bit more explicit than something that you might just find in the writings of a theologian or something like that. So you might find some explicit attestation to this in some theologians prior to 1967, but this is a little bit more official as it's coming from the German bishops there. So in that regard, it's the most it's the first time we've really seen this. So in summary, or rather than saying in summary, let me give a solution here. What is the solution to this problem with the two sides to the same dissenting coin? The radical progressives dissenting from the magisterium and non-definitive teachings. The radical traditionalists also dissenting from teachings of the magisterium in non-definitive cases. What's the solution? It should be obvious. It should be so abundantly obvious. Don't dissent, right? If you have two groups that can't really critique each other because they're guilty of the exact same thing, what's really the alternative here? Don't be part of that coin. Don't be part of the dissenters. Assent to the magisterium. There's a radical suggestion, right? How about we actually accept what the magisterium teaches? How about we do that? I know it's so revolutionary to speak of a Catholic assenting to the magisterium these days. Seems radical. Wow. That's so weird. Because we're so used to dissenters on social media, progressives and traditionalists, constantly dissenting from the magisterium. Well, here's a thought. Let's actually assent to the magisterium. And if you have instances where you don't know how it's true, that is what the church is teaching, still assent to it and say, I may not be able to explain it, I may not be able to defend it, but I accept it. Likewise, this is something you already do in sacred revelation. There are some things in the Bible you may not know how to defend, but you believe it because you know it's infallibly taught. Well, it's the same principle here. Though these may not be infallible teachings, you still can recognize what's taught with authority. And I may not know how to defend it, but I'm still going to assent to it because it's authoritatively taught. You do that, and you will be in a way better position to critique radical progressives when they reject Humanae Vitae, or radical traditionalists when they reject the ecclesiology of Vatican II, which is not revolutionary. It's the ecclesiology of the church even prior to that. You'll be in a way better position because you're not in that realm of dissenting from the magisterium. You'll also be in a more consistent position to now critique the Protestants when they reject the magisterium and Eastern Orthodox when they do the same, because you're not part of that dissenting crowd. And most importantly, you'll be within the will of God, because Pius XII notes that those who are rejecting the non-definitive teachings of the church, he notes in Humani Generis, when you reject those teachings, you're rejecting the one who sent Jesus, that is God the Father. Because what he points out is Jesus said, he who rejects you rejects me, or he who hears you hears me, and he who rejects you rejects me and him who sent me, that is God the Father. He applies that verse to the non-definitive teachings of the popes. So what Pius XII is saying is, when you reject the Pope, even in his non-definitive teachings, you're rejecting Christ and you're rejecting God the Father, because it is God the Father and it is Jesus who have put these shepherds into authority in their teaching office. So when they teach authoritatively, you're rejecting the one who commissioned them. Now, obviously, there are incredibly rare exceptions here where, again, the magisterium could be in error. But again, are you in a position to really know that? Are you really a well-trained theologian who has studied this extensively? And do you really have the breadth and depth as the document says? Do you really have that kind of training to determine, yes, this is an instance where the magisterium is in error? If so, okay. But just remember, you'll give an account for that before the judgment seat of Christ. So make sure you really are. And if you aren't, and you recognize in humility that's not you, okay, well, you're not in a position to dissent from the magisterium. You're not in a position in all good conscience to be able to do so. At the very least, not to do so publicly. Maybe you're internally wrestling with something the magisterium teaches. Okay. But don't get on social media and start blasting the church and blasting the Pope and publicly detracting and publicly dissenting from the magisterium of the church. You're not in a position to do that. It would be good for your own soul not to do that. So hopefully this will help people think through these issues a little bit more carefully and realize that, when they start going down this dissenting route, you start pulling that it's not infallible, therefore I can reject it. You start going down that road, just realize not only are you going to give an account for that, and it's probably doing some damage to your own faith and probably going to make you question leaving the church, but also you're really not in a position to critique others when they do the exact same thing. When they reject Humanae Vitae or reject this or that, you're not in a position to critique them, because you yourself are doing the exact same thing that they're doing. All right. Anyways, I hope this is helpful. I hope this provides a third alternative to you. If you have enjoyed this, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Also check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology. If you like this content, you want to get access to extra content and support what I'm doing here so I can continue to make these videos available for free. All right. That's going to do it, y'all. I will see you later. God bless.
If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now.
Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course, Understanding the Magisterium, for more information. Hey everybody, just wanted to tell you about my new free ebook, Church Chaos, Biblical Insights for Confused Catholics. If you are a confused Catholic and you're thinking about leaving the Catholic Church, or you're thinking about converting to the church, but you see that there's a crisis in the church and you're just unsure, this is the book for you. Again, it is free. Just simply go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up that comes up on your screen. Just simply click on it and you'll put in your email and it will provide you the free PDF ebook right then and there. Please check it out if you're confused about the situation in the Catholic Church today. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless.